This week, I thought I would actually talk about one of my favorite topics, accessibility, and in the work that we do, and kind of bring in a little bit of thinking about ethical problems, even in our field, and how we tackle them, and how our learning theories can help us with some of these. So, many years ago, I was the lead instructional designer for the National Center on Low Incidence Disabilities. And this was before we had web accessibility guidelines and all kinds of solutions that you probably know about now. We didn't have checklists or things like that. The team that I worked with was basically creating a bunch of these checklists, or a lot of the concepts, I should say, behind those checklists. So in our field, we don't tend to talk about accessibility very much. So I'm actually presently working on an article on reframing accessibility using learning theories from our field. So I thought this might be a fun way to explore this week's topic and kind of learn a lot of additional stuff as well as we go. So let's see. I want to start with the idea that accessibility is really a complex problem that's masqueraded as a simple problem. In other words, typically when people talk about accessibility, they talk about, oh, we just need to add alt tags or descriptions or transcripts of a video or things like that. And that really oversimplifies a problem that is really more about learning and how different users or learners are processing the information that they come across. So, many of us are probably familiar with specific accessibility techniques like alt tags or video captioning or descriptive links or transcripts, like I mentioned. And then you might even be familiar with other accessibility techniques. And of course, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines breaks this down into 4 principles of information should be perceivable and operable and understandable and robust. And many of these recommendations really fall under good visual or information design principles that aren't even just about accessibility specifically, but more about navigability. Can a user navigate a website? And readability? Can they make sense of things? Can they integrate it? Is it overwhelming in terms of like cognitive load? So recently, Reber and Estes wrote a piece where they said, addressing individual differences among learners has been an ongoing problem in need of a creative solution for decades. So, defining and understanding accessibility, I think we have to start first by recognizing that as of right now, most of our operational definitions and the way most of us think of it is probably more technocentric. Like I said, thinking about it in terms of the technology or the tools that we use and what we do in those tools to make something more accessible. So it's largely treated as a matter of compliance, Section 508 compliance, or you've got a checklist or something like that. It's also largely ignored in our models of instructional design and in our literature in the field. I've unearthed that in my own research on ethics, and Reber and Estes also mapped this out specifically. They looked at 690 articles in ETR&D, which is Educational Technology Research and Development. It's a major research journal of our field. And they found that out of that, only 6, or about 1%, related to people with disabilities. This is very consistent, by the way, with my own analysis of research in our field around any topic of ethics, that maybe about 1% of our literature tends to talk about these sorts of topics. There's a major book in the field too called Trends and Issues. It's written by Reeser and Dempsey, has 38 chapters. One of those talks about accessibility. And then they looked at one of the major instructional design models in the field, the Dick, Carey, and Carey model, that only mentions compliance with ADA. I looked at the model that I learned and that I used to teach, and it barely includes even a paragraph. In an entire book on instructional design, there's not even barely even a paragraph. And what it has to say is very problematic. And I'll read this here. Although some persons with physical disabilities can participate in regular classes, others cannot. Careful analysis of individual abilities should include observation, interviews, and testing. Many learners with disabilities require special training and individual attention. Therefore, an instructional program may require extensive modification to serve such learners appropriately. Specialists should be part of an instructional planning team. Now, this is a very problematic perspective, and I have an article coming out soon that actually dissects this and look at, well, what are the underlying problems here, and how should we as designers really approach this? If you're not familiar with this text, this is actually an open text that's available at edtechbooks.org. It's the Design for Learning book. Dr. Svila, actually, chapter 6 is her book, and I'm getting ready to write a chapter on ethics for them. But they have a wonderful chapter here on designing for diverse learners. This came out as I was writing up my article critiquing everything. And this is really just an excellent article where I think they do a great job discussing the application, not just of universal design for learning, which has some good ideas, but also has some limitations, but universal design and some ideas from that. And I think that that's really exciting. So just food for thought that if you're wanting to read more on this topic, maybe even for class, that this is a great resource to start with, and you may want to consider reading that, like if you want to dive into this for your weekly assignment or your synthesis paper. But let me get back to accessibility now. What I see as the real problem is that we as a field have a lot to offer this idea of accessibility, but we have not offered any richness to this discussion. So that's part of what I want to attempt today through the use of learning theories to discuss accessibility. So let's just start with a general question. Is a graphic with the alt tag graphic accessible? That may be a legally compliant solution. In other words, technically the image has an alt tag and that's compliant, but it doesn't actually help a user or a learner who comes across that alt tag and is relying on quality information in that to actually learn or make sense of that graphic or even know what to do with it. So first of all, if you want a really fun activity, pull up a browser and Google accessibility fails. And look up any of the images and pick your favorite. And I think this is a good place to start to think about how we can have legally compliant solutions that are actually practically useless. So way back in 2003, and my name was actually Roberts at the time, I wrote a piece called Cognitive Curb Cuts. And I was really exploring how can we use this idea of curb cuts more as a metaphor for instructional accessibility. In other words, when we incorporate accessible design features into the environment, and this is a very universal design sort of question, but when we incorporate these into the learning environment, how does it benefit other learners? And I'll give you a quick example. We actually did a small study, again, many years ago, looking at closed captioning on videos and found that in fact, all of the users, all of the participants in that study were people who didn't have any vision problems or anything like that, and they weren't hard of hearing or deaf. And so we didn't have anybody in the population who actually had a physical disability. But we did find that learners who had closed captioning performed better than those who didn't have it. And we also interviewed those who were using the closed captioning to find that what they were doing was they would turn the closed captioning on to confirm their understanding, or if they heard a new term or a new word or something like that. And what I'd really like to be able to do is make a learning argument around this, not merely that this is something that benefits a small percentage of the population, because, like I said, I worked for a National Center on Low Incidence Disabilities. Well, what that means is most of the time we're talking about a low incidence of the population. But these design decisions really benefit many more people. So I'm trying to get institutions to invest more resources here and make the case. Otherwise, right now, it's very hard, and it's a lot of additional work to incorporate these things. Anyway, let's get to a learning definition of accessibility. So Rayburn asked us to identify 4 levels of accessibility. They talk about social access, which means access to information and opportunities to use resources and materials available to members of a society. You have to start there, they argue, and then there's physical access, which means the resource is available but not in a form that the person can actually use due to physical impairment. So then we have to provide physical access. And then they describe learning access, which includes both intellectual and motivational aspects to it. So here we want to focus on how do we ensure that a person has both the intellectual capacity to understand the content and or the skills and form presented, while also desiring to do so. That having these various things present will facilitate learning access. I would add to this that really part of what this means is that the learner can access the instructional content, interactions, and the learning process as well. There's a lot of emphasis, for example, on being able to access the content, but what about being able to access the interactions and engage in the learning process and some of the either activities or the same cognitive engagement and social engagements that we build into courses to support learning. So as we start to unpack accessibility through a learning lens, we really start to see how this is a very complex problem with some complex challenges to it. Now I'm going to tackle this through a particular lens. Usually when I hear people talk about accessibility and universal design and all that, they start over here around learner analysis. And that chapter that I showed you today definitely starts there. I'm going to pop over to a different spot and talk about it over here in terms of message design and communications theory. So in my piece on cognitive curb cuts, I was really focusing on cognitive accessibility. What does that mean? Well, if I reframe accessibility through a cognitivist lens, then what that suggests is that accessibility is a sense-making and knowledge construction design challenge. In other words, it's not just about the physical access or making sure that there's an alt tag or some sort of compliance issue, but my job, especially as an instructional designer, is to help the learner make sense of the information and construct their knowledge. So if I think about accessibility in these terms as opposed to compliance, well, now I've got a learning problem. So cognitive accessibility considers accessibility through some of the theories and strategies that we already have. For example, reducing cognitive load, which is cognitive load theory, chunking information for better retention and schema development, which comes from, again, cognitivism and schema theory, providing gestalt and gestalt theory, a sense of how the pieces fit together as a whole for learners, and also challenges us to better articulate what media and interface design communicates through its structure and its style, and also challenges us to consider affective as well as cognitive content of graphics and interfaces and how that gets communicated. And I'll talk through some examples of this in action as we go here. All right, so I'm going to look at this through instructional message design theory, and I'm going to look at this across paradigms. M.J. Bishop wrote an article in 2014 that's just a really good summary of the different paradigms that we've been learning about, behaviorism, cognitivism, constructivism for instructional message design. So I'm going to use that as a structure to take this apart and discuss it. So what are the major theories or frameworks of message design in this paradigm? I'll talk about each of those. What do those imply for how we design instruction and our learning? And how can we reframe accessibility based on this? All right, let's look at behaviorism. Some of the major theories from behaviorism related to instructional message design in particular are communication theory, or in particular information transmission. The implications of this theory is that the message is central. The message should have certain features in order to accomplish the desirable communication outcomes. In other words, if we just design the message right, then people will take the right message from it. It will send the right information. It will create the conditions for necessary learning or communication, provide immediate reinforcement for student learning, and with feedback. So under behaviorism, messages here are stimuli. The messages that we craft are stimulus, maybe a stimulus that prompts certain behaviors. And I think this is a good example of why we may not want to just throw behaviorism out altogether, because there's some ways in which this is a useful way to think about message design, especially for accessibility. So I'm going to give you a few prompts. I'm not going to answer these for you. I just want to prompt this for you and get you thinking about it. But if this is our definition of like learning and message design, that we want to design messages or stimuli to create the right conditions for learning or communication outcomes, then what would be the implications of this for accessibility? I know this is a bit tricky. So what would social learning look like here? What would physical learning look like here? Or social access, I'm sorry, what would physical access look like? And what would learning or intellectual and motivational access look like? I'm using Reber and Estes here to structure some brainstorming. Well, let's look at an example. Some examples of this include message design in the interface. Specifically, like there's a lot in interface design that is about cueing or sending that stimulus, or the directional or navigational structure. We send a lot of these messages and communicate that to learners who have sight or things like that, through colors and placement and arrangement, and even the particular graphic or visual choice that we make, like an arrow as opposed to something that looks like a stop sign or a play sign, or something that looks like a document symbol. And you pick up on all of these visual cues as a learner, but these are really important messages. But what we are doing with these is cueing behavior. They're functioning like stimuli. So an alt tag in this case shouldn't simply be arrow, but really thinking about, well, what does this mean? What message does the arrow communicate? For example, go to the next screen. If you select a color scheme, then why? Why is it there? Is there something important about that, like a feel or aesthetic or a message that you could capture? So if we think about alt tags, and I've seen some people use alt equals nothing to alt equals go to the next screen, to the alt tag is go to the overview section. So if you're a learner think about the message differences, the messaging differences that are being received here depending upon how an alt tag is used. So it's not just the simple fact of whether an alt tag is used, but how it is used. Now, of course, graphics may, some of them may be useful, some of them may be instructional, some of them may be purely decorative. So there's a lot of debate around what to do with decorative images. Some people actually like to leave the alt tag blank around that. I like to actually provide a very quick, brief description of it, but start by saying this is not an essential graphic, or you could even say non-essential visual of Egyptian guys dancing or something. I have that in one of my instructional tutorials I built. And that way, if you feel like having the Egyptian guys dancing is sort of an aesthetic or something that you want to communicate, then you would incorporate that in. And here you can see even there's some difference between saying go to the next screen versus go to the overview section. If the next screen is the overview section, then obviously the last alt tag here really helps the learner orient and cognitively organize the content in their mind. It helps them develop a necessary schema. So again, it's not just accessibility to, oh, this is what this image does, but we're using these accessibility features to help facilitate learning and cognition and knowledge organization and all of that good stuff. Okay, so cognitivism. Some of the major theories under cognitivism: information processing and cognitive load theories, selection, organization, and integration. These are a lot of the major theories. You're going to be reading about them. Implications are, rather than just responding, we want people to know, like fundamentally understand. We want them engaged in an active process of acquiring, organizing, and constructing new understandings. So again, not just knowing what a graphic is and being able to take a quick behavior based on that, or action based on that, but really fundamentally understanding something. Message design under cognitivism focuses on helping learners process information. So like helping them make clear delineations between salient features, or organize presentations hierarchically, or show relationships, and provide meaningful connections to existing knowledge structures. This is getting more complicated. So once again, we want to think about, okay, what would learning access look like under a cognitivist paradigm in terms of social access, physical access, and learning access, intellectual and motivational. So we take these ideas and start to think, well, how can I use these theories to help facilitate intellectual and motivational access? What might that suggest for our practices? Let me give you an example. Many years ago, I worked for, like I said, the National Center on Low Incidence Disability. It was actually at a university up in Colorado, and we had the Western Regional Graduate Program. So it was an online program for all of the 14 Western states. And here we've got this visual where we were trying to capture the idea of all of the different states that were part of this Western Regional Graduate Program. There's a lot of information going on in this visual, just like there typically is for a lot of instructional visuals. We've got, Hawaii with the palm trees and the totem poles, and of course, the lovely Southwest desert, and the farm fields across, like up into Colorado, and the plains out through Colorado and Wyoming. So a lot is going on in this visual. And then we've got the 14 stars representing the 14 different states. So for visuals and multimedia content, how are you facilitating access to more than just the words? And there may even be like multiple means of representation, and you want to use that, or using a flexible or variety of using flexible or a variety of strategies to help learners understand the information. So this may include things like embedding directions that summarize the interface for users so they're not spending their cognitive load reorganizing the layout. I'll give you a quick example. Or in this case, like I've got right here, using alt tags or D-links to convey content and the complex information, including like with some meaning, what are the aesthetics of this? Also, this is where, universal design for learning may make sense, like closed captioning benefiting all learners. I want to circle back to this example of the interface design and cognitive load. I didn't snag an image of this one, but when we first started designing websites at the National Center, we actually would work with users who were blind or had various visual impairments or whatnot to test our designs with them. And I cannot say enough about just the process, the act of testing your design with different users. This really, for me personally, like changed me as a designer and how I think about things. And I remember one time we were sitting with this user. She was kind of a super user. She's very technically adept. And so we sat down with her and went through the websites and the course sites that we had built and just observing and interviewing her and, doing things like that for some usability testing. And what we realized was going on was at the time, and this is going to date things quite a bit, at the time we were using frames to set up the website. We realized that what she was doing every time she went to a brand new page, she was having to go through every single frame and reread with a screen reader all of the content in that frame just to make sure that nothing had changed on her either in the main menu or in the side menu on the side, because we had a frame across the top as the main menu and then the sub menu along the side, and then the main frame was all of the content. This is a pretty typical way to set up instruction in a web format. And this was inducing significant cognitive load, whereas a sighted user would quickly scan all of that and in half a second realize nothing changed, and they would focus their attention on the main content, which is where we want them focusing because that's where the learning content is at. She was having to go through and reprocess in her brain all three of the frames fully every time. And that induces a tremendous amount of cognitive load. So we decided, why don't we aim to reduce the cognitive load by building in what we called white on white, because, web page was white. And so we would have information actually just embedded right there in the page that before she had to read anything, it would say, nothing in this frame will change for this website. So when we embedded those messages for her, she was like, oh, this is fantastic, because now I know I can just ignore these frames and I can focus on the content. And so we significantly decreased the amount of time that she and others were wasting trying to reprocess content that didn't change, and increase the amount of time and their focus and attention on the actual stuff that we wanted them spending their cognitive resources on. So that for me was one of the most compelling examples of how we can use our learning theories to really better approach this idea of accessibility. Okay, so let's wrap up real quick with looking at accessibility through the lens of constructivism. This one's a little bit trickier. I've got the same question, so as we go, I want you to be thinking about, what does learning access look like? What is social access, physical, and learning, either intellectual or motivational access, look like here? A major theory, for example, from constructivism is conversation theory. That and you've been learning about constructivism. We want learners interacting with each other and having conversation among participants. And so there's a lot of emphasis on technology facilitated environments that support conversations among learners. What we saw for a long time, especially in environments like Zoom, and a lot of its precursors like Illuminate or Blackboard Collaborate, or a number of other video chat services was that their definition of accessibility was that after the conversation was done, they would transcribe it and make that transcript available, and anybody who needed that accessibility could read the transcript. Well, what that means is the learner who may need that type of access isn't able to participate in the actual conversation, in the actual interactions that are taking place. So now we're talking about more than just content and more than just interface design and cues and things like that. We're really talking about how much can a learner participate, how much access do they have to the interactions in the learning environment that are important to the learning process. So again, an example of this, thinking through, do learners have access to important interactions with each other and the instructors so that they can participate in the social aspects of learning? Another way to frame this is also asking the question, is the system itself or the interface flexible enough that a user can readily adapt it to their particular needs? For example, live chats. Are live chats accessible and not just provided transcripts afterwards? Or maybe even using cascading style sheets, because CSS allows learners to swap in their own CSS and adapt the learning environment to their particular needs. It's a very cool detail. And I think it's also a good example of where having technical knowledge in an area, you don't have to know all the things about all the things, but working on accessibility, I do think often requires having some in-depth knowledge of how a particular technology or learning environment works. So here in this example, these are from some of the pages that we built. You can see we link right to a style sheet. This is just what it's named. Well, by doing this, our learners could actually swap in their own style sheets and say maybe they need like a black background with yellow text is what really works for them and their visual impairment. Well, instead of me trying to predict all the possible variations like that, a CSS allows me to just say, okay, well, here's the CSS that we're going to use, but we're going to make this very flexible through a CSS so that somebody else can say, well, what I really need is like light gray with, green text on that or something, that's what works for me. And then they can swap in their CSS. Now, if you're thinking, oh my goodness, this all sounds really advanced and technical, there are a lot of very tech savvy users out there who would know exactly how to do this. We just need to give them the option, the flexibility of being able to do that in the sites that we build. All right, so let's summarize. From the three major paradigms, we have questions like, how can we convey important messages? How can we reduce cognitive load? And how can we ensure that all learners have access to interactions and can participate in the learning environment and in the learning interactions? And how can we make sure that learning systems or spaces are flexible? So now, hopefully, when I ask you, well, what is accessibility? I'm hopeful that maybe you're revisiting your original definition of that and thinking about how you might revise that now, in particular, in light of these learning theories and these different major paradigms.